So one of the best reasons to study wilderness survival skills is for the freedom and confidence that they give. When we are trying to learn country living skills, basic survival skills are a great help in giving a perspective of gratitude for all improvements. When we are facing hard times, when we are facing tyranny and oppression, war, unrest, destruction, famine, this internal freedom and confidence in God and nature can make all the difference between noble independence and cowardly servitude to evil. So we want to learn to be at home in our Father's house. In the wilderness, in this strange land, the exiles found want, deprivation, and terrors by day and night. This is what it requires to build character. It was required to build the character that could produce the nation that we are blessed to enjoy. God does not needlessly afflict his children. So as we go through this presentation, I would like you to think about which areas you personally need more detail on the most. Please mention these points in the chat or the comments. Okay, what is survival? It's the act of staying alive. So how many of us enjoy visiting our grandparents? Is this a scary place to go, or do we feel safe, happy, and at home? So let's look at some elements of hospitality. So in order to provide these things, nature provides the bulk of it, but there's a few tools that can really make getting started a lot easier. So wilderness survival starts when we get up in the morning. Our first consideration is appropriate clothing. The only way we can be reasonably sure to have good clothing in an emergency is to always wear functional clothing. But much fashionable clothing, especially footwear, can be crippling. So we especially want to pay attention to shoes and socks, especially in the colder climates. But walking is a primary survival skill. So when we are hiking, what are our needs? We're just going out for a few hours. One thing we need to be prepared for is latrine calls. Nature's call can come suddenly, and it needs to be responded to promptly. This will simplify many health and sanitation issues. The wilderness provides every necessity, including privacy, waste disposal, and toilet paper substitutes. Populated areas can be difficult. So when we're walking, we need to look for toilet paper substitutes, just to have, in case. Fire-making tinder, just in case we need it. It's usually wise to bring some old shopping bags along just for picking whatever wild edibles or other useful items. Tin cans are highly valuable in a primitive environment for heating water, for boiling, for cooking. They're lightweight and they buy us a lot of time. They can last for months of continuous use. Baling twine and other cordage. Sometimes there's natural vines and other materials that we can pick up, certain kinds of bark, like cedar bark, basswood bark. If we don't have these man-made items like tin cans and empty bottles, there are ways to construct them from wood, clay, baskets that can be coated with pitch or lined with clay, birch bark, animal parts, skins, organs, different things can be made into watertight containers. We can heat rocks around the fire and then place them in a container of water to heat and even boil water. Basic hiking gear. The staff is included in that weight. So what's in this bag? Clothing. And in the back pocket of the pack, I have some other items. And the empty pack, the bag itself weighed 0.9 pounds. So it's almost 1 pound empty weight. Shelters. Remember, we have a tarp in this pack. Bedding, especially in the cooler climates, but pretty much anywhere you're going to need a certain amount of bedding in order to get adequate sleep. Now we can gather natural materials for bedding, which can take a few days depending on the situation, getting them dried out to where they're comfortable and properly arranged. But if we can carry some basic bedding, that's a great blessing. Now, the military uses what's called the extreme cold weather sleep system to go anywhere in the world and be able to get a good night's rest. These systems can be heavy. They're typically at least 12 pounds and tend to be bulky. They may require a sled or multiple trips with a backpack to transport, but they will allow us to sleep outdoors in almost any weather. We must get sleep, otherwise fatigue will set in and destroy our ability to function. So your sleeping bag system for the extreme cold weather sleep system is a patrol bag, which is typically rated to, you can sleep in it comfortably at temperatures that are down to freezing. And then there's an overbag that you can use in addition to that. So when it gets too cold to be comfortable in just your patrol bag, which might weigh 4 pounds, you add your overbag, which this particular overbag in the picture weighs about 6.5. And then over that, in wet situations or in Arctic situations, over on the right, we see a picture of a bivy sack. The bivy sack is used to provide a waterproof sleeping compartment. It can be used in the mud, it can be buried in the snow, depending on the situation. They do tend to get damp inside from condensation, so they're going to have to be dried out fairly regularly. But there's often times when the bivy sack is the best option for adverse circumstances. Lights. There are very many options. The most basic form of light is a candle or a torch. And remember the pitch stick we had in our fire starting equipment. If we make a thin piece of that, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, we can light it and burn it like a candle for a few minutes. So that can be a field expedient candle. Of course, lamps made with oil, such as we see over here on the right, were used extensively in Bible times. A piece of wick down in the oil and then leaned up through the spout would hold a flame. Use a small amount of oil and they would preserve fire and light all night long. On the lower right, we have what's sometimes called a bug. There's just a tin can laid on its side. So a shiny can is valuable because it directs more light to the front. So that's your primitive flashlight for walking. Most of the time, If the wind isn't too strong, you won't have any issue with the candle blowing out while you're walking. Especially around the homestead, the kerosene hurricane lantern is ideal for many applications. If they have too many modes and settings, the circuitry seems to fail frequently. So I like something that's basically just on and off. I like a flashlight that uses either a single AA battery or that has a USB rechargeable lithium battery. It's not expensive or difficult to get a little portable solar panel that produces 1 or 2 watts that will recharge your flashlight off of solar power. So if you have a good fresh lithium battery and that solar panel, potentially you should be able to walk away from civilization for up to 10 years without having to buy new batteries. But there are situations where we do not want our light mounted on our head. We want it in our hand instead. And a regular flashlight that could be clipped in the waistband or carried in a pocket is outstanding. And if we can't transport it, plan on being prepared to work hard and improvise on site. It's better to be there and scrounge than it is to be weighed down with too much of a boat anchor of a backpack. Everything needs to be oriented to the mission at hand. Tents and shelters. Now, one time I went out camping and we sat in the rain for about 5 days. It was 3 days of steady rain. And we had a fire. We were able to keep reasonably dry, but we quickly learned the value of being able to have a fire underneath the roof. So a tarp that's pitched up high enough to provide shelter without the rain blowing under it. If you can have a small fire under the roof, that helps a lot. The Indians always had fires in their teepees, in their wigwams. There was often a lot of trouble with smoke. A modern wall tent with a stove with a chimney provides a lot of the benefits. Also, you'll notice that teepee in the picture is glowing like a light bulb. If you have a stove, your tent won't glow like a light bulb so much. So if you need to stay concealed, having a stove is almost a necessity. You can build these out of natural materials if you have time. Nessmuk in Woodcraft and Camping says, I've spoken of some of the best camps I know. As Indian camp, campfires that should be made with a reflector. His shanty tent, which he was very fond of. I've spoken of some of the best camps I know. The worst ones are all closed camps in which one is required to seclude himself through the hours of sleep in damp and darkness, utterly cut off from the cheerful, healthful light and warmth of the campfire. So it's better to have an open shelter with a fire in many cases than it is to have a closed shelter with no fire. So important wilderness skills. Right at the top of the list, we have walking and load bearing. Navigational awareness. We want to know whose rights we need to respect. And situational awareness. That's just a general awareness of everything around us. Knife and tool safety. That's something that's best developed by starting children out when they're as young as possible. They quickly pick up the intuition and reflexes to be safe and effective. When we're dealing with older people, that learning curve is going to be slower, but it's and it will never develop to the extent that it would have if they'd started younger, but we take what we get. Sharpening. There's a lot of talk about which knives are best and which saws are best, but in almost every case, sharpness beats the greatness of the tool. And sharpness requires constant maintenance. In our knife and tool using habits, we need to be aware of anything we do that would tend to dull the tools, because we can avoid a tremendous amount of sharpening if we just know what not to do. Cutting skills. And there's all manner of wisdom to be gained in techniques for construction, techniques for processing natural materials. Fire making, management, and control. Learn to get a small fire going, learn to keep that fire going under wilderness environmental conditions. But we do want to move on to learn those skills of flint and steel, fire by friction, and these things that civilization didn't give and can never take away. Fire control. Fire is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. We cannot live without it, but if we don't keep it under control, we can't live with it either. So we need to be aware of what burns and what doesn't. And the best way to learn that is by a lot of careful doing under controlled circumstances. In learning to make fire in wet and adverse conditions, we will also learn what doesn't burn and where the line is between what burns and what doesn't. And that's your biggest asset in knowing how to control fire. Knots, lashing, and cordage making. Learning to make cordage from natural materials is an absolutely important primitive skill. Water sources. Whether you're developing a spring, water filter construction. Making a water filter in a bucket or in a section of hollow log or some other container using usually straw at the bottom, then gravel, then sand, then silt, and even clay at the very top. Pouring the water through that will usually remove, and also adding charcoal in the mix along with the sand and other materials will remove most chemical and biological toxins and pathogens from the water. It does not remove salt. Removing salt will require either distillation or reverse osmosis. First aid and primitive medicine. In a true long-term wilderness survival situation, you may not have the ability to call in advanced medical support. Or if you do, it may take days to arrive. So sometimes our first aid is our only aid, and we want to study the topic from that perspective. The things that are around us that are the most useful for relieving suffering and preserving life need to be studied. Wild edible plants, which would also go to include medicinal plants. There is a tremendous amount of edible material in nature. There's also the poisonous things, and we want to know what the really seriously poisonous things are so we avoid them. We especially want to remember things that are available in the dead of winter Like here we have the Bryoria fremonti lichen on the trees. The inner layer of bark on many trees is also edible and readily available. So wild edibles may not be our first choice of subsistence, but they're certainly better than nothing, and they can make our regular foods much more complete. Clothing and footwear making. We need good clothing and footwear. The Lord tells us that if we have food and raiment, we can be there with content. Learning to provide clothing and footwear from nature is a much neglected science that we really need to focus on. Whether it's making wooden shoes, leather moccasins, tanning hides, making clothing out of blankets, learning to process wool, flax, metal fibers. There are many plants that can be made into clothing. Cedar bark has often been used for crude clothing. Think about it. Let me know which topics would be most helpful to you to hear more about.